think we're going to get started. Okay. Hi, I'm Megan Bolsler. I'm the co-president of Law Students for Reproductive Justice, and on behalf of ACS, LSRJ, and FLF, I want to welcome you today to the new age of abortion restrictions. Listen up, it's about you. Before I introduce Ms. Melling, I have a few quick announcements. One is that in the hallway there's a table with some information on the American Constitution Society and Law Students for Reproductive Justice, so please check it out. And we also have a really quick and easy way to get involved. You can fill out a postcard from Planned Parenthood of Indiana and state your opposition to legislation that's currently has passed the House and Senate. So if you want information on that, please see the table outside afterwards. Also, the American Constitutional Society is having its national conference this summer from June 13th to the 15th in DC. There's a lot of great educational events and networking opportunities, and there's also scholarships available to cover the cost of going. So if you have any questions about this, see Jim Spangler. My last announcement is that the Planned Parenthood of Indiana is having a speaker on Get Yourself Tested Month tomorrow at 2 o'clock at the Lafayette Health Center. They're going to have a speaker, and then Friday there's discounted STD testing. So if you have any questions on this, contact Planned Parenthood of Indiana or Amanda Stevens. We are really honored and thrilled to have Ms. Melling here today. She's a very accomplished lawyer and a very inspiring advocate. Ms. Melling is a graduate of Yale Law School and has been with the American Civil Liberties Union since 1992, serving in several roles before becoming the director of its Reproductive Freedom Project in 2003. In 2010, she became the ACLU Deputy Legal Director and Director of its Center for Liberty. The center encompasses the ACLU's work on reproductive freedom, women's rights, LGBT rights and AIDS, and the freedom of religion and belief. In her role as Deputy Legal Director, Ms. Melling directs the campaign to end the use of religion to discriminate. Please join me in welcoming such a wonderful attorney and reproductive rights advocate.
Hi there, thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks to ACS, thanks to LSRJ, thanks to Dawn. As I always say, wherever Dawn goes, I want to go. And thanks for turning out, even though you have exams coming up. I realize pizza is a draw, but still, thanks so much, because I'm not sure I would have been so kind. So I was thinking about this talk, and thinking about the 40th anniversary of Roe, which is, this year, and what to say. And I'm not traditionally somebody who's really at a loss for words, but I was definitely hit the pause button about what to say. And I crafted some stuff, and then I was sitting in my office late on Monday night, and I looked back and I came upon this talk I did in January for the actual anniversary, and it was in New York. So I want to tell you what I said in January, and then I'll tell you what I'd written a couple days before about this. So in January I said, I'm delighted to be here to celebrate the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, and my word is celebrate. The speaker before me had talked all about the difference Roe had made for women's lives and women's health. And I went on to say, for me, it's much more personal and emotional. For me, my life is radically different from the life my mother had in terms of my capacity to think about my education, to think about family, and to have some modicum of control over it. So for me, I'm eternally grateful for that and think of Roe as something to celebrate and something really worth fighting for. That was January. So now flash forward to April, and I wrote, 40th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. I'm really glad my 40th birthday didn't go down like this. If my 40th birthday had gone down like this, it would have been an instance of people sort of smacking me and lashing out at me and attacking to see what bits of me could stand come 41. So yeah, what a difference a few months can make. And here's the thing that's true. Both things are true. I stand here today still to say that I think Roe versus Wade, it's incredibly important to mark, to celebrate, and to fight for. And the last few months have shown how incredibly important it is to pay attention and to stand up and be counted in that respect. I'm going to just talk today about 4 different themes and really try to leave plenty of time for question and answers. So one is the challenges we face today. The other is what troubles me most, and I'll try to do that in only a few minutes. The reason for passion and what gives me hope, because I have come back to the office every day for 13 years working on this issue. So what troubles me most? The challenges of the time. The challenges aren't even what troubles me most. You'll see that. The challenges of the times, you see it in the newspaper. It is just an extraordinary time. In the last, 8 to 6 weeks, let me just sort of run down what's happened. And I do have to look down because there's so much that I don't actually trust my brain to keep it all in there. So first, Arkansas passes a ban on abortions after 12 weeks. I call our communications department, I'm like, dudes, this is a really big deal. I haven't seen anything like this in my 20 years at the ACLU, a ban of this scope actually pass, actually get enacted. So Arkansas goes first. Not to sort of, retain that honor of being the most restrictive for long. In comes North Dakota. And North Dakota passes a ban that basically starts at around 6 weeks, which is around the time when most women first even really have much of a chance of knowing that they're pregnant. At the same time, North Dakota bans abortions that women might seek because they've had a diagnosis of a problem with the fetus. North Dakota also passes a measure to put on the ballot for 2014 a personhood provision. North Dakota also passes a provision saying that doctors who provide abortions have to have admitting privileges at local hospitals. And we're going to pause here for a second because that could sound eminently reasonable for some people, right? Like, you think, sure. Well, there's a couple of issues with that. One is, last time I checked, lots of hospitals wouldn't let abortions be performed. Lots of hospitals and the management of hospitals are opposed to abortions. So a provision like this can, in essence, give a hospital a third-party veto over whether or not abortions happen in that state. One clinic in North Dakota. Another thing, in some states, even if the hospital is sort of willing, they have a rule that sort of says we give admitting privileges to people who admit as many as 20 patients a year. They have a number. Fortunately, there usually aren't 20 patients admitted from any facility or by any doctor in the face of abortion, given how incredibly safe abortion is. And third, many hospitals require a doctor who's going to get admitted privileges to be somebody who lives in the state. But in a state like North Dakota, there is no doctor willing to staff the clinic, and the doctors fly in. So what may sound to you, and now let me just add another point, which is important, which is it doesn't mean if the doctor doesn't have privileges that the woman doesn't get taken care of. Doctors at the facilities have alternate arrangements with another doctor who could admit them, or it's also the case that the hospital is required by federal law to admit a woman or anybody if they present in the context of an emergency. So reasonable sounding law, big problem. Not so reasonable when you really look. Okay, that was bad. Then along comes Virginia, and Virginia bans all insurance for abortion in the exchanges. Many states were on that train last year. Virginia went this year. Alabama, there was just, I think, a press conference yesterday with Alabama also enacting a measure saying that doctors have to have admitting privileges at the hospital. In Alabama, we expect that measure, if it goes into effect, could effectively outlaw about half the clinics in the state. Kansas has an omnibus measure going forward, which I think is also getting signed into law this week, expected to, which the opponents describe as, Troy Newman describes as delightful from Operation Rescue, because it opens up so many avenues for restrictions on women's capacity to have an abortion. Later this week, Virginia will approve a series of regulations that had caused the head of the Department of Health to resign last year. These are regulations that also will impose severe restrictions on clinics, and we would expect if those regulations go into effect, a host of clinics will close. And yes, Indiana, oh, don't be left out. Indiana, which has engaged in plenty of mischief in the past, is at it again. And Indiana has a measure, I believe it's on the governor's desk, which would, in essence, it targets one of the Planned Parenthoods. It targets a Planned Parenthood that provides only medical abortions. It imposes a host of restrictions on medical physicians who provide medical abortions, and it too puts that clinic in jeopardy. And the sessions aren't over. We celebrate when the state legislatures go out in my office. There's really nothing better in the world than when that happens. There are some states that try to do good stuff, don't get me wrong, but of course we do focus on the cutbacks. And this is really on top of everything else, right? Simultaneous, you have all this crazy stuff going on with abortion, then you have 50 states around the country with people challenging, including Notre Dame, challenging the requirement that contraception be covered in insurance plans. I'm still in recovery over the notion that we're having fights over contraception in 2014. And you had the wave, tremendous wave in the last couple of years targeting Planned Parenthood, with 17 different kinds of ways for states to try to defund Planned Parenthood and anybody who has, the audacity to provide women's health services that encompass abortion. So, lots of people say, well, but there's the law, right? You can just go into court and take care of these things. We will go to court, and I totally expect that we will be able to take care of the Arkansas ban and the North Dakota ban. But those bans, even though we can knock those out, even though we will prevent those from going into effect, those bans are dangerous in the following sense. One is, why is it that those states in 2012 had the audacity to pass those? What is it that makes two states think that there's no political cost in this sense at this moment? That troubles me deeply about these, even if we can win as a matter of law. Second, look, I'm sort of kind of worked up about the fact that these bans passed. And other people are too. And one of the problems in the public conversation about the bans is I think they distract people from the other stuff that is going through and will likely stick. Some of it will stick. So you kind of think, ban, oh my God, enjoined. Or, those people, they didn't pass a ban, and you sort of have a sigh of relief. They didn't pass a ban, but instead they passed something else nefarious that gets less attention, like the requirement that the doctors have admitting privileges at the hospital. So the bans, really keep your eye on the other things, because the other things to some degree can wind up being the real prize, so to speak, in terms of women's continued access to abortion care. And look, we can bring challenges to these other measures, but we're not sitting around in my office brimming with confidence about the future of these requirements that doctors have to have admitting privileges. We live in a world, right, where John Roberts is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Everything turns on Justice Kennedy, really, and we have a standard governing abortion, the undue burden standard, which has enough malleability for a court really to find what it wants. I mean, I don't mean to be that crass, but there's a lot of wiggle room in that standard. And I sometimes compare it to the sort of obscenity standard, like the courts know it when they see it, but they really haven't seen it very much when it comes to the undue burden standard. If you were to sort of line up the restrictions, we win some and we lose some. So if you look at the cumulative effects since Casey in 1992, there really are quite a layer of restrictions in the states that create barriers for women's access to clinics. So those are the challenges of today. So what troubles me most, and it's not that, what troubles me most is the stigma surrounding abortion now. What I've just described is all a part of it. The stigma helps to pave the ground for things to pass. And what passes helps to reinforce the stigma. But I really have seen nothing like it. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples. I think it was President Obama's first term, and it was very early. It was the anniversary of Roe versus Wade, and he issued, I think it was like a 2-paragraph statement. The word abortion never appeared in the statement on the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. I don't even think he used the sort of, quasi-euphemism termination of pregnancy, prompting me to think, I believe my blog was entitled, it might have been Shut Up or something as gracious as that, because that really was my feeling, which is, oh my God, you're the president of the United States of America, and the word abortion can't even come out because it has gotten to be such a fraught word. I had an assistant who worked for me who went to a seven-sister college, and then she's working for the ACLU. She's in the Reproductive Freedom Project. She looks at those Guttmacher statistics. Please do pay attention to this outside. And she said, oh my God, 1 in 3 women have an abortion. I've never met one. And I was like, oh yeah, you have. But I thought she has been in totally safe environments, or certainly stereotypically safe environments, and she hasn't met anybody. Right? And if you haven't met anybody, right, you can form and retain whatever your stereotype is. Nothing shakes up that image that gets cast about what happens. Then, of course, there are the movies like Knocked Up Schmortion, or however it's phrased in that movie, right? The word, again, is unspeakable. And the one that sort of rattles me most is there was a case filed within the last 2 years by nurses in New Jersey. They worked for a public hospital in New Jersey. And they sued, saying it was a violation of their religious freedom for them to be required to participate in pre- and post-op on abortion. The hospital was not saying that they had to participate in abortions. It was pre- and post-op. So we were kind of like, I wonder what's involved in pre- and post-op at that hospital. Like, does that mean that you're in the OR or not? And pre- and post-op, as best we could tell from the papers, involved things like taking blood pressure, checking somebody in, making sure they had a ride home, That was too much, right? They brought a suit to get an agreement from the hospital that they wouldn't even have to do that. So I said, so that's like handing out a hospital Johnny with a big scarlet letter A for women who go into this hospital seeking abortions. I may have amnesia, but I swear this was not the world that I entered in 1990. When did I start? 1992, permanently on staff. This is a big, big change. And you add on to it sort of the rest of the culture. Many hospitals don't provide abortions. Many medical schools don't teach abortion. And then you have, I was deeply offended by those restrictions on funding that said no government dollars can go to somebody if they provide abortions, even if we're not funding the abortions. No dollars can go to somebody even if they refer for abortions, even if we're not paying for that. That is another way of saying that the topic is untouchable, right? So that troubles me. It sort of follows on the standard. In the Casey standard, what the court says, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the case in 1992, where the court sort of reaffirms the essential holding that the federal Constitution protects abortion but changes the standard. What the court says there, in part, is the government can use its resources to try to dissuade women from having abortions, to favor childbirth over abortion. That's a really... Don't take that lightly. In the sense, where else is there a federal constitutional right where the government exercises its power to discourage you from using it, right? That's a crazy notion. But I think that is a backdrop against which so many other things happen so as to reinforce the stigma. So I'm troubled by the stigma because I think it really does pave the way for what I talked about before, which are the challenges and what's happening in the states. Okay, so this is a bad story. Why should you play? Why should you participate in this, right? Especially in the face of the fact that today it's still true, despite what I said, that 1 million women still get abortions, right? So I obsess on this question about why people should care. I care, as I said to my friends at breakfast, I care because my mother talked about what it was like to have unintended pregnancies. My parents so loved us that it was sort of like a regular conversation, but she talked about different points in her life where the fact that she had children or kind of kept having children when she didn't really think she would, just changed certain decisions or foreclosed certain decisions. And I have no idea what she would have done if the world were different. I actually bet she would have had all of us and sort of, made that choice, but she didn't have that choice. So I grew up in her house. I grew up at a time when, when my siblings went to school, like Yale was still all male, or Ella Grasso was the first woman ever running to be governor, or, women, I know people 10 years older than I who got pregnant and got sent away, because they got sent away. Nobody talked about it. And women couldn't have credit cards in their name. I feel like I'm a dinosaur, but I do visit the Museum of Natural History. But there was no way. I was angry as a kid. I understood the world was not right for women. And I understood that control over whether you could have a child was a huge factor. But I look at the staff. I'm the oldest person on my staff. And I think, okay, so somebody growing up today grows up and the world looks, thank goodness, really different. Women have different roles in society. The world feels open, even if it's not totally open. The world's really different. Abortion is available. Birth control is better. Birth control is more available. So why make this your issue, especially when it kind of looks like a drag, right? The fight just keeps going and going, and it can get tiresome. So here are my reasons why I hope you'll care. So the top line is, what our laws about abortion say a lot about how we think about women. And how we think about women also says a lot about how we think about men. And how we think about gender stereotypes also really does have a huge implication for LGBT people. So my first thing about thinking about the world today and what we're seeing in 2013 is this is sort of make this your issue or put this on your list of causes if you think that the proper role for women should be something, or society should encourage us to be something, not to be mothers, but not only mothers, that that's not our only proper role. Because what does it say if we're passing laws that ban abortions? It says that we think that the other choice to not have or continue a pregnancy is wrong. What does it say in the public discourse? The public discourse that we have around abortion is now so often, and my office engages in it too sometimes because for reasons I could explain, but the public discourse is often so much about women who might seek abortion because of rape or because of incest or because of a fetal anomaly. But that's not the majority. That doesn't touch the majority of women who are getting abortions. But those are the stories that are sympathetic to the public. But the women who are really getting abortions are the women who don't have the money for a child, already have kids and don't want more, just can't manage it, just don't want to have a child, aren't ready to have a child. They are women who are making different choices about how they want to run their lives. But that story isn't out there in the public right now, and that story isn't out in part because one of the mantras that you get from you can favor childbirth over abortion, you could ban abortion, you can have waiting periods, you can have all these other things, is that somehow it's wrong to make those choices. That somehow it's really selfish. And I look and I think that looks too much like the world. That message is the message from my youth. That message is not what so many women before me fought hard to open up these doors. And if you don't want those to sort of close very slowly and subtly, then this is an important issue. The other reason is you should make this your issue if you think, let me just pause for 1 second. I also think that if you see the proper role for women as mothers, I don't think that then there's a role for men. There's a gender role for men, and I don't think that's a walk in the park either, and something that we really want to endorse a rigid role for men any more than we want to endorse a rigid role for women. But make this your issue also if you think women can think. I talked about the restrictions that are passing through the country this year. But the restrictions that were passing through, the wave that was hitting hard 2 years ago and sort of before that were waves, you have it in Indiana, what we refer to as, the waiting period. You have to go see a counselor, be counseled about abortion, and then no matter what, you have to wait a certain number of hours. And across the country, they range from 24 to 48, now to 72. We're challenging that in South Dakota. You get sent home to wait. So what does that say? We often talk about how hard that makes abortion to get. But what it really says is, we don't actually trust you to be able to make a decision. We don't think that you could have thought these things all by yourself or talked to somebody or figured it out. And when you say, I'm at peace with my decision, we're not really going to trust that. We're going to send you home. We now increasingly in states have measures to require women to have ultrasounds and for the doctors to describe the ultrasound to women. Again, what does that say? That you don't know what's going on? That you need to be helped to figure this out? That we don't trust you to understand what pregnancy is and what an abortion is? In South Dakota, there's a provision that requires women to be told abortion kills a living human being. Again, really? Because, that one's just about, can we just stigmatize the hell out of her? And then, why am I blanking? There's one other that really rattles me up. But anyway, you see what I'm saying. These are about not trusting women to actually think and not trusting women to know what's going on in a way that I don't see in other contexts. So if you actually want to be seen as a decision maker, somebody who can be trusted to make your own decisions, to think, then these are your issues. And even if you're not in a state where this is happening, but you are, It matters because these are cultural stories. There is a reason why Obama's not saying abortion. There is a reason why Juno is saying schmortion. There's a reason why my assistant doesn't know. And it is because of all these different kinds of pernicious ways in which the culture gets invaded, I think, by these incredibly subtle messages. But they are subtle, which is why you need to stick your antenna up. So the last is because I think at the end of the day, being able to choose whether or not you want to have children is about choosing how you want to have relationships and families and all sorts of different things. And when Anthony Romero, my boss, was talking at one of the lobby days in D.C., he said, this is the question about Roe versus Wade is really a question about who you love and how you structure your families. It is a question, do not forget, in some ways this is a question, now people talk about abortion and people talk about LGBT as if they're totally separate issues, but they are all about how we construct families, how we think about families, how we recreate a vision that was the dominant vision, and they are all about genders not being locked in one very rigid notion of a gender stereotype. Okay, so if you're convinced and now you feel passionate, then we go to why do I have optimism? Why the hell do I show up every day in the face of this year after year? And that's because at the end of the day, you can cling to visions of hope. And my vision of hope really is, sort of all of you, because you may not believe it, but what your activism makes a tremendous difference. It mattered, not enough. But it mattered in 2012 that people protested in Virginia when that ultrasound measure was going through. I mean, that was an Occupy Wall Street measure. It didn't stop what we're seeing in 2013, but the governor, several other restrictive bills didn't go through that year. The wave of ultrasound restrictions that was about to fly in 2012 didn't fly. I don't really understand why 13 looks so bad given the activism of 12, but 12 would have been worse but for the activism. And back to so it matters for your legislators. It matters for your governors. If there's no price to pay, why wouldn't they do this? They're going to get rewarded by somebody, trust me, because the other side is quite agitated. And I also think it matters for the courts. And that is not a sentence I would have uttered 25 years ago, I don't think. But it's not that the courts, are reading, I don't think the courts are reading Gallup polls and making decisions based on what they read in Gallup polls, but I firmly believe that the courts are willing to stay 2 steps ahead of the public maybe, but not 20 steps ahead of the public, right? If there's no activism, if there's no momentum sort of in our way, then I think it is just harder in some sense. And I just think you look at some of the death penalty cases, right? And I'm not saying, some of these things are convenient as a way of explaining what you do as opposed to necessarily causal for what the justices do. But looking at the transitions such that juveniles, for example, looking at the state laws that sort of stop agreeing to have juveniles be subject to the death penalty, Kennedy and others sort of looked to that. I think about the strategy for gay marriage. The strategy of gay marriage was not like, oh yeah, we'll go to the Supreme Court first, that would be cool. The strategy was to figure out how many states, to build up momentum in a certain number of states so that it would seem less scary as a social change. But if the wave were entirely against us, it just I think it does make things just a little bit harder. And I'm not saying that, look, I don't think I'm one of the people I brought there who doesn't think that Roe is about to be overruled in any fashion. Not at that level, they continue to be cut back. But I do think it matters to the courts. But the other thing is if none of us speak out, if we can't stand up in the face of the stigma, why in the world should the AMA, for example, why should the legislator who's going to come up for election, why should, the governor stand up if we aren't willing to stand up in the face of these challenges? So that's my plea. We can't sit back. We can't be invisible. And I want to close with a story because breakfast I was asked sort of how I don't get depressed, and it's not medication. So I have next to my desk I have a picture of a client from my first or second case at the ACLU. So my first or second case at the ACLU was a challenge in Idaho. I brought a case under the Idaho State Constitution, arguing that the Idaho State Constitution required the state to pay for abortions on the same terms as it paid for other pregnancy-related care. You may all think like, oh, that's crazy talk. It wasn't. It was great fun. Anyway, so one of my clients, I made friends with the providers in the state, including somebody who worked in a hospital, a doctor who worked in a hospital. And the nurse called me one day, and she said, we just saw a woman who's 18, and she just got a bad diagnosis for her child. She wanted to have this child. And she said, she said, you could call her, here's her number. So I called this woman who was known as Linda Coe in the papers, and I said, I don't know what you're deciding, but we have a case, and should you decide that you don't want to continue the pregnancy and you can't afford this, we would be willing to add you to the case and try to get the state to have to pay. And she said, I need to think about this. I want to talk to my friends. So she called back, and she wanted to talk to, she had a friend who had a child with disabilities, and she wanted to make further inquiries and think about it. And she called me back, and she said, I'd like your help. I'm 18. We're newly married. This is just too much for us to have right now. The hospital told her that she needed $2,500 to walk in the door to have her abortion. Linda Coe didn't begin to have $2,500. She was on Medicaid. So we put her in our case, and we filed an emergency motion with the judge, asking the judge to order the state to pay for her abortion. And the judge denied our motion. He later ruled on our behalf on the big question, but he denied our motion. And so my colleagues and I spent that night calling people to raise money. If you're the lawyer, you can't pay out of your own pocket. We would happily raised it in the office, but you can't pay for your client's expenses. So we call people and raise money. I'll hustle any one of you on that night if you give me your contact information. And so we raised the money to pay for her abortion as well as for the funeral she wanted to have for her child. This was a wanted pregnancy. That was 1993 or 94. Linda Coe regularly sends me pictures of the children she went on to have. There's never been 6 months that have passed in these almost 20 years where Linda Coe and I haven't talked. Before cell phones, when Linda couldn't afford her phone, she would call me from the gas station, collect, to see how things were. After the blackout in 9/11, not later after 9/11, the first message on my machine was not from my mother, but it was from Linda Coe saying, I just want to make sure you're okay. Linda Coe and I stay in touch because abortion matters. Abortion matters to real women and real families and real people's lives. So do what you can here in Indiana. Thanks. So I ended on time so you could have questions or conversations.
It seems to me that one of the biggest problems with the stigmatism is this sort of cultural shift that's been happening in the post-Roe sort of world, where the sort of median compromising sort of idea just keeps getting pushed further and further away from a woman's right to self-determination. And with that sort of aspect, you said you were hopeful, but it seems to me that the courts are almost in a bad position to fight this. That what's really necessary is more of a cultural sort of engagement with trying to change the message and trying to take control of the conversation, where you're not having to fall back on preposterous sort of arguments like incest and rape, when really it's a much broader issue. You can go back to the fact that lots of responsible mothers get abortions for very responsible reasons. But even then, that's relegating it to the idea that these are responsible mothers, when motherhood shouldn't be the be-all, end-all in the first place. So how do you change that message as a lawyer, outside of a litigation sort of scenario?
Oh, if I had the perfect 5 words as an answer. You're correct. I think in my view that culture is huge. I mean, you notice, okay, so I'm a lawyer. I love the law. I love being a litigator. There's really nothing more fun than winning a case. It's just a total rush. But I didn't talk about the law because I think that, the law isn't, certainly right now, isn't the answer. I don't think the cultural answer is the perfect, message that we would all say on a Sunday talk show, if that makes sense. There's tremendous resources that go from the reproductive rights community into trying to figure out what the message is and how to try to move people. I increasingly think a whole lot of it has to do with one-on-one this is my opinion. This isn't like some, sort of tested winning strategy or something. It has to do with one-on-one conversations, because I go back to how easy it is to have a negative stereotype if you have no real person to think of, if that makes sense. And I know, so for example, one of the things you often hear is the LGBT movement, for example, and don't separate the law and culture don't have to be separate, in the sense that the LGBT movement, for example, brings cases in my office sometimes where they definitely don't think they're going to win, but they bring the case because they then have an opportunity to tell a story, right or wrong. The media pays attention when you file a story in a different way than if you just try to seize a megaphone. And so they, for years, have been bringing cases involving adoption, foster care, and marriage as a way of trying to showcase relationships and to make lesbian and gay people look like the family that's watching the television, in some sense, to seem more familiar, less scary to whatever people's stereotypes are. But when people talk about stories, right, there's a whole lot of conversation on reproductive rights where people say, oh, we should just tell stories the same way LGBT told stories. We should just come out. And so I've been at conferences where women stand up and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, I had an abortion, then they start their talk. I'm like, wow, huh. LGBT said that the way that they did it, the research was kind of, you talk to, and this is a basic you talk to somebody in your sphere of trust and communication. So you talk to your sister, your cousin, your neighbor, your teacher, somebody who knows and trusts you such that they're willing to open their ears, as opposed to just a public pronouncement where people just bring whatever they bring to listening. So I don't have the magic answer, but I do think the fact that nobody's met a woman who has an abortion is not helpful. And I do think the fact that nobody's talking, look, it's part of the backdrop of society. It's part of how we all live our lives. It's part of what, has changed so much about sexual relations in this culture. But it's a real difference, right? Linda Coe was my client. I had 6 women in that case as individual women plaintiffs. There hasn't been an individual woman plaintiff in a case in probably a decade now or something in the reproductive rights world, because even under pseudonym women aren't willing to come forward. That's not a concrete answer for you. I don't have the perfect answer about the change, but I know that not saying anything, not objecting, not protesting, not telling people why you care is kind of, I sort of want to say a death knell, but that's a little extreme.
I just want to thank you for your ending. It kind of hit us with a couple tears over here, but it was really good. As a first-year law student, we take on long to progression of cases after Roe. It gets really depressing really fast.
Yeah.
So it's great to hear you say that you have faith in Roe being upheld. Could you explain a little bit as to why you believe that?
And I will tell you that I don't even know if you agree with me, Dawn. Lots of very smart people I respect don't agree with me. I'll just say that. So first of all, in the current composition of the court, even though Kennedy was nothing short of furious in the Carhart decisions. I mean, it's sort of like it's hard to almost hold the paper when you read his decision because it's so hot. I just keep looking back at Casey and just think I don't think he'd be willing to go all the way back. Not all the way back. When I say Roe, I mean like all the way back, saying there is no constitutional protection. And the other, and I think it's almost not, it may also in some sense not be necessary. The chipping away is so dramatic and there's so much room for the chipping away that I don't, there's a huge debate among the antis as to whether or not this is even productive. A lot of the antis are really miffed, at what happened in Arkansas and in particular North Dakota, saying this is counterproductive. You're going to kind of agitate their base, and it's not going to stop any abortions because they're just going to get it enjoined. So I think, really for the long term, the strategy is much more the chip strategy, and the courts open the door to the chip strategy, and my guess is we'll open the door further to that strategy unless we see a real change. And I'm talking about a change in the lower courts too. I mean, the lower courts are just, don't keep your eye only on the Supreme Court. The lower courts are just screwing us in so many different ways. But I guess I think the cost would be high. The cost would be really high of reversing Roe. But other people say, like, Melling, you're on crack, in the sense of Scalia, Tom, they don't care about the political cost. They don't care at all. So I guess it really, do vote everywhere and as often as you can.
How has the religious issue come into this? Because, and I know you haven't talked about fertility, but I look at abortion and fertility is not covered by insurance, and most people, even in the Council of Bishops, they're all, think that IVF is just as bad as abortion. And to me, if you take those two things together, as well as the homosexual issue, I can't get around that the idea is just God makes these decisions for us, and we don't get to choose otherwise. And how does that come in with the, we have a constitutional right to choose religion or not to choose religion, and the separation of church and state. How does that come into this, or has it come into this yet?
So, I want to say, and sorry, forgive me for this, Roe had a challenge. There was a challenge on Establishment Clause grounds, wasn't? Oh no, I'm thinking of Ken Bowen also.
Well, the funding cases.
Yes.
They litigated based on
The federal ones.
Establishment Clause.
Yeah, included a challenge that to deny women access for abortion within Medicaid and not while still paying for childbirth. Reflected one particular religious view, and I don't know if you've read those glorious cases yet.
One week.
I found those were among the three most depressing cases I read in law school. I think they still stand as among the most depressing, even this many years later. But the court rejected that. Religion is obviously an incredible factor in a couple different ways. One is that people who believe that abortion is murder or that in vitro is immoral are really active, right? It's a highly, highly motivated base with some really powerful players. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, that is one powerful troop, even if they are speaking in a way that is not wholly, in any sense, congruent with their base. The other way in which we're seeing religion play out, and you're seeing it here in Indiana, certainly is, these 50 lawsuits challenging even the contraception requirement, to say that this is, first of all, there was really vocal opposition to the mandate that insurance cover contraception on the grounds that this was a violation of religion and imposing a particular view, and the administration rejected that and said, what was I to say? Oh yeah, about time, and put this in. But now you have 50 lawsuits around the country of varying institutions, ranging from archdioceses to universities to for-profit mining companies, saying to make me provide a plan that even covers contraception is a violation of my religious rights. One of those cases will go to the Supreme Court, I would expect, even next year. Right now the courts are split on whether it's an infringement of the rights of the plaintiff. The question in the cases hasn't been, is does the whole law fall in its big glory, but is it unconstitutional as applied to that plaintiff? Split in the circuits, I think, as of like last week. I think it was 3-3 in the circuits on emergency injunctions as opposed to on merits. Nobody's looked at the merits yet. Does that touches on but doesn't fully address your question, I think.
Yeah, I guess it's has anybody made the argument that taken as a whole, this is obviously the state acting in a religiously motivated way?
Other than those earlier cases, but look, it's hard in the sense that all these things are about, in some sense, look, the provision for contraception is about health, and it's also about values of women's equality, right? You can say that laws prohibiting murder coincide with certain religious values or whatever, and I've often had a fantasy that we would run a campaign just featuring the Archbishop, and that would be like the Center for Liberty's like target for the next 20 years. But at the end of the day, religious groups have as much right to lobby and push as you and I do in some sense. And you and I are going to push for our values, which are based on, be it our different religion or our own just personal heartfelt beliefs. I mean, certainly everybody calls it out, right? I mean, the prime opposition and the most vocal opposition is from organized religion. And so you can call that out, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong.
I definitely, thank you for your talk. I definitely think that we've sort of normalized violence against women in this country. It's just something that is sort of a norm, an undercurrent norm. If we look at, you talked about the stigma and the discrimination against women who've had abortions. I feel like there's that sort of cloud around rape victims or things like that. How do you think that we can attack, not just with just abortion, but just giving women more rights and just
do that. Yes.
Right, but how do we do that in different avenues of the law, just beyond this?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, it does break my heart really to read like the Steubenville facts, and there was such a wave in the press, between the horror stories in India and then Steubenville, and I forget and then you had the South Africa, just a lot of very high profile acts of violence. And before I went to law school, I worked in the domestic violence world. And so sometimes you sort of think, you kind of hope those things have radically improved, but the picture still seems to be the same. I think those are huge challenges in part, as you say, because they are, I think there's a lot of discrimination that goes on against women that's almost, I sometimes describe it as it's like the wallpaper in some sense. It's just like a backdrop, and people almost don't even notice it because it happens, and it happens in offices all the time in these incredibly subtle little ways. And I'm not up to date on the law in the domestic violence world as well to know. When I was first in the movement, it was at the time when people were arguing for mandatory arrest laws, and we were just training police to, in fact, recognize this as a crime as opposed to part of the privacy of the home. So I don't have your answer on how to work that as a matter of law, especially because my understanding, there were huge advances in the law. Well, we thought were advances in the law, like huge advances in the early 80s, huge advances in terms of money going for police training. And the Women's Rights Project is in heavy conversations with the Department of Justice about when they do surveys of police, like they just did in Puerto Rico, that you don't just look at whether that domestic violence has to be part of it. It's not a question of just do the police abuse social protesters. It has to be a question of whether the police actually intervene in instances in which there's other kinds of violence, or whether the police are in fact engaging. I mean, there's of course high profile cases of police arrested for domestic violence. To continue that push, and to push where you can't get it at the department level, to push for supervision to the extent DOJ and other people have that capacity. Tough lawsuits against the police, right? There was the case that went to the Supreme Court within the last, I'm going to say 5 years, Gonzalez, of the woman in Colorado who had a protective order and had 3 children, three daughters, I think it was either 2 or 3. And, the husband had the kids, and she called and said, he's not back, I'm worried. I have a protective order. She called again, I'm worried, and bottom line, 3 children were killed. And brought a lawsuit against the police saying they wholly failed their responsibilities, but the immunity doctrines around the police make that particular avenue, at least right now, a challenge.
I wonder if you could comment on a statement by Obama quoting Clinton that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Because I think there is some tension between the anti-stigma and the rare.
I agree.
I'd be very curious what you think about it.
That Clinton statement was definitely a source of chatter, right, in the office. Like, of course, at the end of we in my office, as well as like everybody sort of in women's rights and reproductive rights, spends a ton of time arguing for real sex ed for students, arguing for real information about birth control, arguing for access to birth control, arguing for, sort of trainings to empower boys and girls to sort of feel comfortable saying no, as opposed to like feeling kind of speechless in the face of early sexual encounters. So in that sense, certainly have a goal to give everybody the tools they want so as to avoid having an unintended pregnancy. Like nobody wants to have an unintended pregnancy. But still, I agree that the phrase, we've tried to walk this very fine, wacky line of saying, do everything you can so that unintended pregnancy doesn't happen, as opposed to saying that abortion is rare for fear that it really does stigmatize. And as I say, like life is really messy. That's one of the things about this, right? Rare. I know a lot of really charming kids with crazy smart parents with everything available to them, and those were unintended pregnancies, right? I mean, the world is just not perfect. Everybody sort of either makes mistakes or gets carried away or whatever, right? So rare, it feels to me as if it does, it can contribute to the stigma, and it also may not be totally in sync with reality in a certain sense. But yes, I agree, it has played out in a way that I do think contributes, even if our goal is to empower everybody not to have unintended pregnancies, not to have those. Dawn?
So when I was at ARAL, which is America, we came up with the phrase, this was in probably 1991 or so, safe, legal, and less necessary is what we put out there. And then Clinton came along and changed the less necessary, which was intended to capture the prevention side
message.
of it and put more of a focus on that, and changed it to rare, which was an unfortunate but understandable that a politician would do that. But I wanted to ask you about the role of the courts in all this. So I think you're right to focus on the work has to be done at the level of culture and politics, and that is the only, and personal conversations with trusted individuals. But in the end, are state legislatures in Indiana and North Dakota ever going to vote down provisions like the admitting privileges or physical plant requirements for providers of abortion services? Or in the end, do we have to, and I just don't see that happening. I think in the end, it's, I think, going to have to be the courts who take a close look at those things if we have any hope of living without these reasonable sounding restrictions that shut down all the providers, or the last provider in North Dakota.
I don't disagree with that. I think one of the reasons I emphasize culture is it used to be, especially early on, this was true for you too, I'm sure, in the early days, in like the early 90s or whatever, the state legislatures would consider things and people would literally call the office and say, we're not going to fix it, we're going to let it go through because we know you can stop it, right? And I still think as a person, and it was true, and as a person who now travels around representing a litigation shop, and in the face of what's going on in North Dakota and Arkansas, I think there is some view that, the courts will take care of it. Right, there is this right, and the courts will take care of it. So perhaps I've shifted a little bit further than I need to in the narrative of like, please, don't assume anything, and don't. The more you count on that, the more complicated it will be. And the courts, I do think I don't quite. I'm sort of interested in how the second, the narrative around the Second Amendment and the court shift around the Second Amendment happened, right? Because that is a phenomenal. Everybody laughed, like literally laughed out loud at the idea that the court was going to take this kind of stance when you looked at this question 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and voila, there it is, right? So I don't know what the other the undue burden standard just is, just terrible. That's my polite word for it. And so the question is,
will ever be
changed
or applied in a way to invalidate those kinds of restrictions, like the admitting privilege requirement?
Well, in the places where it's passing, it's tough, right? So, there's two different things. One is, I had the great misfortune of participating in a challenge of the federal abortion ban in New York, and it was a Clinton appointee who was like vehemently anti-choice. So obviously it depends on who appoints judges and what kinds of judges get appointed. So you can imagine maybe with a different bench, you did have in Indiana one of the only district court rulings saying that a bias counseling waiting period was unconstitutional, right? So it can happen. Thank you, Seventh Circuit, for your mischief. So who appoints judges, which goes back to how important it is to pay attention to politics and be engaged. And I guess I hold out some hope that maybe there's a way to push a different standard if you had a different Supreme Court. Look, they came up with the undue burden standard instead of the old standard. So perhaps if there were a shift and, goodbye Justice Scalia, goodbye Justice Thomas, one of them were replaced by somebody progressive, perhaps there's some different vision. And I kind of think maybe it's a different vision. I know there's good reason to think that sex discrimination is a different way of arguing it, could have different traction, but I don't know whether, I kind of think maybe whatever the answer is something different from that still, in the sense they want something totally different. And so maybe the standard could get changed and have more teeth. But yes, the courts, at the end of the day, in Mississippi, I don't yet see the legislature doing the right thing. We're not thinking the court's going to do the right thing. The court did the right thing on admitting privileges back in the early 90s when I had a case there, Republican judge, but that just shows you I had 5 clients, I had 5 providers, I had private doctors with practices who came out to speak. Huge difference from then to now. Not confident the courts will do the right thing. But yes, the courts in many places are going to be the only, they will be your stopgap. But maybe you all just want to run for office in Indiana. That's, when people say like, oh, how do I get your job? I think I always feel like a pig saying this, but like, okay, I've got a great job. I love my job. It's fantastic. But you all in the Indiana state legislature could probably do a lot more good than I can these days, right? I mean, and I'm serious about this. Like so much happens at the state level. So much happens at the state level that does real good for real people and advances these issues. Or become a judge, a state judge. We'd like to have those state constitutions have more vigor. All sorts of things you can do to help out that are interesting and fun.
I was kind of confused recently reading about the Colorado case where a Catholic hospital had failed to save a woman and her unborn child when she came to the emergency room, and their defense for facing 2 murder charges was that a fetus is not a person. And I was just kind of confused about how that fit with the rest of the religious arguments, since there were Catholic hospitals. I didn't know if that was a blip on the radar or what, but.
Forgive me, I don't know the case. Go ahead.
Well, just to her point, they typically argue that
That I know. I know what the Catholic.
Person, and now they're arguing when it's in their favor that it's not, and so they couldn't be liable for that non-survival.
Nothing like a little money to sort of write a little. I'm sure it's the insurance company who's arguing, but still, yes, they're arguing on behalf of the hospital. But I
was just curious.
that's unusual in the sense that the Catholic hospitals are usually quite consistent in their stance, and there's often a hierarchy too, as we saw in Arizona, to reinforce that they be consistent in their stance, steadfast in their stance. So. Definitely unusual. I mean, that's the kind of thing possibly you can make hay out of for like a couple of days in the press, but you often don't get as much mileage out of that as we would hope, in some sense. Other questions? Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much.